we good to go?
There we go. Okay, now it makes sense why people weren't able to do it, because that's what happens when you turn it on. Okay. All right. Good morning. We're heading into noon. It's 12:03. It's nice to see everybody on the call. My name is Charlene Clark. I'm one of the project leads for the Archipel OHT, which covers the region of the Ottawa East and Prescott Russell area. This is our fourth wave of information sessions, and today we are here with Hazel Hunt with a very important session. And so I'm just going to try to do some AV magic in the background to try to allow you guys to turn on your mics and video for that question period. So we will go through a lot of information today. It should be around 45 minutes. So we ask that you keep your questions for the end. And at that 45-minute mark, we'll end the recording and open up the floor for questions. All right, over to you, Hazel.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Charlene. Okay, so I'm so grateful to have all of you here with me today. This is a topic that is, of course, extremely near and dear to my heart. Having a therapist for myself in 2017 is when I first started therapy. I was rock bottom. I was a drug addict. I was doing sex work to pay for my drugs, and I was actively suicidal. And now here I am in front of you. I work as a long-term mental health counselor at CFS Ottawa. I also run my own private practice where I primarily work with transgender clients. But as many of you are probably aware, my community has always been going through a hard time, but right now especially things are very dark. In the United States, over 400,000 trans people and family members have moved from the sort of worst transphobic laws in states like in the far south. That's about 15% of the overall American transgender population. When surveyed, over 50% of transgender Americans indicated that they would like to move to another country. And with our latest changes to immigration law here in Canada, where if you have ancestry, right, you can apply, without a doubt, we are going to be seeing a massive wave of Americans coming here. They are going to be uprooted from family and home and culture, and many of them are going to be traumatized from what they have been experiencing in the United States. So if even just one of you comes away today with a better sense of how to help transgender, non-binary, and gender questioning clients, I will be so grateful. So thank you for giving me that opportunity. So to start, the most basic thing that you need to be familiar with in order to be sort of culturally competent with transgender clients is terminology. You need to understand the language that we're using to describe our experience and to describe ourselves. I think when it comes to something like cultural sensitivity, the main thing that we're really looking for, right, is we want when that client gets up and leaves our office after the appointment, we really don't want them thinking this person just doesn't get it, right? You don't have to be perfect, right? And you certainly don't want to let perfect be the enemy of the good. But if you have a basic lay of the land, you won't have to force your client into the position of being a diplomat or an educator, right? That's kind of my job. So the approach on a most basic level, right? So you need to know that for any minority demographic, right, terminology is culture and time dependent and it changes, right? But this is especially true for the transgender community because throughout the 20th century, we didn't really have control of the narrative. We were heavily pathologized and medicalized, right? So it's only been in recent decades that trans activists have managed to sort of to gain control and to actually prescribe the language that we'd like to have used for ourselves. So if you are kind of assuming that you're up to date and you know the language you should be using, try to get rid of that assumption, okay? It's always changing. Also, so we are a demographic where if you are making assumptions, you're probably going to get yourself into a little bit of trouble. Okay, one of the things the human brain loves to do is it loves to sort of look at people, right? And then it'll pick up on sort of gendered signifiers, right? So you might be looking at me today and you'll see my hair, right? And you'll see my jewelry, you'll see the kind of clothing that I'm wearing. And that sort of, symbology will give your brain a sense of what my pronouns are and what gender I likely identify as, right? But as much as possible, especially for clients who are early in questioning and early in transition, right? You want to avoid making that assumption. Still, you're a human being. It's probably going to happen anyway. If you're going to make an assumption, try to base it off of the things that the client can control, right? So I have a little bit of power over my hair, right? And I can choose the clothes that I wear. I can't really do much about this thing, right? Not unless I have a lot of money for surgery, right? I can't do a lot about my voice unless also I have money for things like voice training, right? So you want to avoid making an assumption, but if your brain's getting into that area, try to focus on the things that the client can control. Now, one of the common sort of stereotypes about the community is that if you get something wrong about us, we are going to bite your head off, right? This, in my own anecdotal experience, could not be further from the truth. The vast majority of my friends, myself, as well as many of my clients, typically what's going on is you will be sitting at like maybe the family dinner table, right? Or you'll be going to work and people will be messing up. And you feel lucky, right? That you even get to sit at that table. You feel lucky that you even get to have a job, right? So what you're going to do is you're going to dissociate, right? You're going to daydream and you're going to try to keep a low profile. Okay. So don't be afraid. Okay. We don't bite. Now, always try to ask about pronouns and identity if you can, right? And I mean, this is another thing about the community. So the vast, like an enormous percentage of the trans community is neurodivergent, right? So we have very high rates of ADHD and very high rates of autism spectrum disorder, right? Which means that our executive functioning for things like our working memory, right, is oftentimes struggling a bit, right? So we mess up all the time. And what saves us from one another is knowing that we are approaching with good intent, right? So if you can have that warmth and that safety in approaching your clients, that will save you from any kind of real friction when there's a big mistake, okay? Now, I have a note here, right, that says, if you mess up, apologize briefly and move on. This is very important. So I will have wonderful allies in my life, right? My parents, thankfully, are supportive, right? And I have supportive friends, even going all the way back to childhood. I'm very, very lucky. But, sometimes I'm hanging out with one of these people and they mess up and they go, oh my goodness, Hazel, I'm so, so sorry. I promise I don't see you that way. I don't know what came over me. It just slipped out. I can't believe I said that, right? And sort of what's happening, right, is, well, misgendering is something that I'm used to, right? I have to deal with it. It's a part of my life, right? So for me at this point, it's kind of like a nuisance, right? It's not the end of the world. It's kind of like a mosquito bite, right? But if that apology is sort of drawn out, right, it's like we're hovering over that mosquito bite, right? It's getting kind of itchy. On top of that, right, what's happening is there's a centering of the other person, right? So if my friend is kind of freaking out a little bit, all of a sudden I'm put into a position where I need to calm them down, right? I'm taking care of them, right? So you want to avoid that with your clients as much as possible. The only circumstance I would say where it's better to extend that apology is if within the therapeutic relationship, you know that this is somebody who has not ever had accountability for somebody getting this thing wrong before. Okay, so the first trans client I ever worked with as a therapist, she had not had someone use her name or her pronouns in 3 years, right? She was living at home with her family and nobody had used her name in 3 years. Okay, so in our therapeutic relationship, at one point she decided to try out like a new name and I messed up, right? And she was like, oh, Hazel, don't worry about it, right? I've only been doing that for like 2 weeks. And I was like, no, it's important, right? You're not taking up too much space. You're not bothering me. This is a matter of basic respect, right? And it's the same thing for cis people, right? If your name was Jonathan and you preferred to go by John, right? If you express that and then people kept calling you Jonathan, right? That would kind of create friction. It would feel disrespectful, right? So it's letting your client know, right? This is not too much to ask. You are not inflicting this on the world. This is the basic respect that everybody deserves. Okay? Like any therapeutic rupture, if we can mend and move through it, the therapeutic relationship gets stronger. Over here, I just have a brief, LGBTQIA2S+. The first time I was practicing this presentation, I was doing it in front of my father, and he was like, lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, anything else I ask. So I thought it might be helpful to do a brief review, right? So it's lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, asexual, two-spirited, and the plus is for anything else. Today, we're mostly going to be talking about the T and the Q, right? Queer is a term. It used to be sort of like a slur. It has been reclaimed by the community, and it refers to basically anybody who is not cis. We're going to define that in the next slide. And anybody who is sort of not straight, right? Not heterosexual. It's an umbrella term. Okay. Getting into basic terminology here. So trans is an adjective. It is not a noun, okay? It's an adjective that modifies a noun, right? So it would be inappropriate to say that you have a trans waiting for you in the lobby, right? Or that you have a trans in your office, or that you saw a trans walking down the street, right? It would be similar as, if you said something like, I had a black in my office, or I saw a black walking down the street, right? That is some 1920s stuff. You want to avoid that as much as possible, right? So it's trans space woman, or trans space man, or trans space person. And the reason I like to point this out is because it'll also kind of give you a sense of like really what's going on, right? So let's take another example of sort of an adjective modifying a noun in terms of describing a person, right? So let's use the term adoptive mom, right? So we understand, right, that an adoptive mom is still a mom because she's doing the act of mothering, right? And only extremely cruel or mean people would suggest that an adoptive mom is not a real mom, right? So that's the same model we're using here when we say something like trans woman or trans man, okay? So trans as a term, it comes from Latin. It simply means across, beyond, or on the other side of, right? So if your gender identity does not align with the sex you were assigned at birth, you are trans, right? So this means that if you are a non-binary person, right, you also fall under the trans umbrella. Okay, not too many people getting assigned non-binary at birth, right? So if you arrive at non-binary, right, you probably had to travel a little bit, right? You're probably on the other side of where you started. Now, we also use the term cis. This, for some reason, was made controversial. Elon Musk declared that it was a slur on Twitter because he was, well, very upset that his child had come out, right? But we were actually trying to be very nice when we came up with this term, right? We were simply just using the Latin equivalent, right? Cis in Latin means on this side of, right? So if your gender identity aligns with what was assigned to you at birth, you are cis. No hard feelings, right? We're just trying to come up with terminology. I think it's important to have words like this because it stops the pathologization, right? So if we just had the word trans and then we had normal people, right? If we just had the word homosexual and then we had normal people, right? That creates a sense of pathology, right? So it's important to have homosexual and heterosexual, trans and cis. Okay, just a very quick review of some acronyms. So M to F, F to M, AMAB, and AFAB. This is sort of used to describe the direction that you've been traveling. Typically speaking, we are not really going to use these terms unless we're trying to very specifically communicate to you where our starting point was. We might use this term to sort of define people online who've had a similar experience to us. As a clinician, you should never really be using this term unless for some reason it's absolutely relevant to the conversation at hand or to like a consultation, right? So I'm not going to walk down the hallway at my office and say, I have an M to F trans woman in my office, right? That's typically information that we feel kind of embarrassed about, right? Being trans, it's kind of like we want that to be the least interesting thing about us, right? It's this nuisance that we've had to deal with, right? It's this obstacle we've had to overcome, right? We don't want to think about it anymore, right? We want to get past it, right? So someone bringing up, oh yeah, your starting point was here. You were assigned male at birth. Typically speaking, we really don't like that when it's coming from cis people, right? So if it's a brief conversation you need to have at the beginning of a therapeutic relationship, that's okay. But for the most part, you want to keep that, out of the conversation. However, I will say, so before I was working as a therapist, I worked at the Shepherds of Good Hope downtown. And while I was there, I had some very supportive colleagues. However, I was extremely early in my transition, so I was not passing yet, right? People didn't really know what I was doing. So what would happen is somebody would walk up to a staff member, and that staff member would need to direct that person to me, right? So they say, go speak to that woman over there in the green sweater, right? So the homeless individual would come up to me and they'd be like, are you the woman in the green sweater? Right? And I'd be like, yeah, don't worry about it, right? So you don't want to just out your client, right? We live in a very hostile world to trans people, right? This is sort of a matter of safety for us, right? At the same time, right? So I'm now over 4 years into my transition, right? You kind of get a sense that you kind of know what I'm putting out there, right? So if you were to say, right, like, oh, there's a trans woman therapist waiting for you in the lobby, that's kind of extra information now, right? You could probably say there's a woman therapist in the lobby waiting for you, and people will be able to figure out that it's me, right? So having a bit of nuance, a bit of common sense in where you use these terms, right? Don't just default to the politically correct thing all the time. Focus on your client's safety. Dead name. So I think most people assume that we use the term dead name because we hate our old names, right? And while it's true that hearing our dead name is something that's really upsetting to us, it's often one of the hardest parts about hanging out with old family and friends. The actual origin of this term came from the fact that in the 20th century, it was very difficult for us to legally change our names. So when you died, right, they would write about you in the newspaper and they put a name on your gravestone, right? It was the name they'd use for you when you were dead, right? So that's where this term actually came from. We change our names because our names typically are associated with gender, right? If your name is Jack, people are going to assume he, him. If your name is Jacqueline, they're going to assume she, her, right? So changing that name is an important part of being recognized as the gender that you identify as, right? Having a preferred name field on your intake form is extremely important if you're working with a transgender population, right? Having a way so that that client can circumvent their legal name, that's so important. Also, if you as a clinician, if you can help your client with the very difficult task of getting their name changed, they need guarantors. They often need a lot of money to do this, right? So, again, many of us are neurodivergent. Even just sitting down with them for one session and helping them get started, that can be an enormous help. The dead name is a constant point of friction, right? It's on your credit card, it's on your ID, right? It's often coming up all the time. Getting rid of that as much as you can really helps. Just a review of the outdated terminology. So transvestite, that's like the 1920s. You'll see it in like serial killer movies where we're the bad guys, right? A client should never be using that term to self-describe. If they are, they're probably making a joke or being self-deprecating. Okay, transsexual was the term used sort of from the 1960s until the early 2000s. You might encounter somebody self-describing with this term, and it's actually just the term that they prefer. But the contemporary politically correct term is transgender, and that is because we found that transsexual, it placed too much emphasis on sexuality, right? We're not transitioning for sex reasons, right? We're transitioning because we feel deep down in the core of our beings, right, that something is off. It's, it does touch upon sex, but it touches upon every other aspect of life, right? So you're going to defer to the client and use the term that they use, right? Unless you detect that there's something self-loathing or self-hating in the use of a term. Non-binary terminology. Okay, so a non-binary person is somebody who doesn't identify with the binary gender setup, right? So the binary model would tell you that there are men and there are women. A non-binary person is like, neither of those are particularly accurate, right? So they often use they, them pronouns, right? And sometimes they'll use any or all pronouns. If they say they are trans-masc, it usually means they are leaning towards that side of the gender spectrum, right? They might be taking testosterone to masculinize their appearance. Sometimes you'll hear words like trans-masc or trans-femme used for people who are fully transitioning, like in a binary way. So like I'm a trans woman and I might use the term trans femme to describe myself, but typically speaking, this is going to be a term to describe sort of non-binary lean, right? So if I'm trans femme, I might use she, they pronouns, right? But I don't fully identify as a woman. Two-spirited. So this was a term that was coined at a conference in Manitoba in 1990. And basically a whole bunch of Indigenous leaders got together and they agreed that this could be an umbrella term for the various third gender words that were all throughout various Indigenous languages. Two-spirited, it's sometimes used not just for non-binary identity, it's used for any sort of LGBT Indigenous identity. But there are many Indigenous people who don't like this term and they won't use it. So don't assume that if you're working with an Indigenous trans person that they like this term. This term can also be confusing in the data because StatsCan records it as both a gender and a sexuality. Demi. So you're not going to hear Demi too often, but the kids are getting into it, right? So I want to give you it just in case. Again, going back to our Latin, right? So demi means partly. So if you're a demigod, you're partly a god, like Achilles or Prometheus, right? So if you are a demi-boy or a demi-girl, you're partly a boy or partly a girl. If you're demi-romantic or demisexual, right? Maybe it takes you a longer time to identify if you have romantic feelings. Romantic feelings aren't as strong, right? And if you're demisexual, maybe you really need a strong emotional connection first before you feel sexual attraction towards somebody. If we had more time today, I'd go way more into this because the trans community loves having very specific terms for describing what's going on inside of them, right? We are trying to get out of the language of pathology. So we're trying to normalize this stuff, right? It's like, it's not a problem, right, that I don't feel sexual attraction. Maybe I'm just asexual or demisexual, right? It's just not the same, right? When I walk down the street, I don't feel intense sexual attraction towards people. I don't want to sleep with strangers, whereas I notice that some of my friends, right, are more into that, right? So it's just a way of being able to describe to others what's going on inside of you, and you use these words to connect to community and to resources. I think sometimes the stereotype about us is that we just want the attention, right? And it's like, well, we want attention, but we want typically attention from people like us who get it, right? We're trying to communicate to other people, this is how I feel, okay? Gender fluid. So if you are gender fluid, your gender shifts over time. This can be day to day, week to week, month to month, maybe even year to year. As you move through that shift, you might use a different name. You might use different pronouns. You might change the way that you present. Gender fluid people probably get a lot more flack than just simply a binary trans person like myself, right? I just go out as a woman every day. People, for the most part, I mean, I get some trouble sometimes, but for the most part, they leave me alone, right? But if I'm presenting as male one day, and then the next day I'm presenting as female, that creates a lot more internal strife for the people around me, right, for some reason. So creating safety so that a gender fluid client feels like they can fully express themselves with you as a clinician is a major goal you want to have as a therapist. Agender. I love these people because they are fed up with all of it, right? Everything we just talked about, they're like, ugh, I don't get it. I don't like it. It's boring. It puts me in a box. Why would I be looking for a new label, right? I don't care about gender. I think it's dumb, right? So they're just out of the entire thing. They don't feel like they have any gender. They don't experience gender, okay? Gender is very important to some of us. To others, we're like, yuck, I want to get rid of it, right? So those are sort of your agender folks. Okay, I'm going to briefly cover some medical terminology. So very, very important. So gender nonconformity as a concept, right? If you are cis and you have gender nonconformity, right? Maybe you're a guy and you know what? You like painting your nails, you like doing makeup, you like musicals, right? You're gender nonconforming. You might get bullied for that, right? People might say that you're gay, right? Which is ignorant and stupid, right? But for a trans person who is gender nonconforming, it's different, right? Because let's say you're a trans woman, but you like metal music and playing video games, and you also like working on cars, right? All of a sudden, your gender card itself is under threat. People will say to you, well, you're saying that you're a woman, but I don't think you are because you like doing these things, right? So one of the best interventions you can do with your trans clients to help them with internalized transphobia is cognitive flexibility exercises around this type of thing, right? So for example, you might have a client who's saying, well, I don't think I'm actually a woman because, I still really like metal music, right? And then you can ask them, how would you feel if you met a cis woman who is into metal music, right? Oh, I would just think she's really cool, right? You wouldn't think she's not a woman, right? Like, no, right? That'd be kind of messed up, right? And you can run that for so many things, right? So is a cis woman not a woman if she's infertile, right? Is a cis woman not a woman if she has small breasts or if she has a mastectomy, right? And just to like build that flexibility of like, wait a minute, right? Like for the cis world, you kind of get to have a bit of entitlement to your gender, right? People can't just take that away from you, right? Whereas in the trans world, right, we don't get that same feeling. So getting your client to that point is really, really helpful. Gender incongruence. So the DSM now uses this term, right? This is all you need to be trans, right? A discrepancy between your internal sense of self, right, and what you've been assigned at birth, right? Gender dysphoria is the distress that comes from that discrepancy. Okay, you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. And this used to be one of the major ways that we were gatekept from medical care in the 20th century. If you did not have enough distress, you were not allowed to get care. Okay, and what's really tricky about this, and we'll talk about this later, the distress is often diffuse and hard to identify. When you don't know that you're trans, it can be really, really hard to parse out what's going on. And meanwhile, the dysphoria is still really hurting you. Hormone replacement therapy. We will often abbreviate this to HRT. This is usually the first step in serious medical transition. So you will start taking a new primary sex hormone, right? You'll start taking testosterone if you want to masculinize. You'll start taking estrogen and an anti-androgen if you are trying to feminize. Fun fact about this, so if you are a trans man, you just need to take testosterone, but if you're a trans woman, you need estrogen and a testosterone blocker. And this is because testosterone kind of eats estrogen inside of the body. It's a lot like the patriarchy in real life. And so if you're a trans woman, you have to take this blocker. Sometimes these blockers have annoying side effects. One of the most popular blockers, spironolactone, it makes you have to go to the bathroom really often, right? And you know what's really hard when you're a trans person out in the world, right, is finding a safe bathroom, right? So there's all kinds of little nuances here that are good to understand. Hormone replacement therapy, it helps with physical dysphoria because you're changing the signifiers of your body, right? So you get fat redistribution, you get softer skin, your hair often becomes softer as well, right? You will, typically speaking, have like changes in the functionality of your genitalia that will align closer to your gender identity. Okay, so it's not just looks, it's like how things actually function as well. Then there's neurochemical dysphoria. So the body is frugal, right? It likes to use things for multiple purposes, right? So it uses your endorphin system not only for your natural painkillers, but also to regulate your gastrointestinal system. So if you are an opiate user and you go into withdrawal, right, one of the major side effects is gastrointestinal distress, right? We are recently learning that there are tons of serotonin receptors in your gut, right? So the body is frugal, right? So it's not just using testosterone and estrogen, right, as sex hormones. It's using them as neurotransmitters. So you can imagine if you had a car and it was running on diesel when it needed premium, right? This is what's going on with trans people's brains before medical transition. And it is sometimes agony for us, okay? Gender confirmation surgery, that's the politically correct term. If you ever watched Jerry Springer or Maury, right, the big term they like to use was sex change, right? You got a sex change, but this is the thing. You're not really changing your sex. You're just bringing it into alignment with how you feel, right? We're confirming your gender. You might hear a client talk about top surgery, right? That might be breast augmentation or a mastectomy. You might hear clients talk about bottom surgery, right? So that would be something like an orchiectomy, like removal of the testicles. It could be a vaginoplasty, so converting one's like sort of male genitalia into a vagina. You could also get a phalloplasty if you're a trans man, right? Getting a phallus. Okay, so these will often be abbreviated to top or bottom surgery. If you hear a client say, I'm on the wait list for bottom surgery, that's what they're talking about. Okay, very quickly, questioning terminology. If you are a gender questioning person, right, you are unsure what your gender identity might be. You might start wondering, hey, are all of these symptoms of depression and anxiety and dissociation, are these connected to the fact that I've always never really liked being a boy, being a girl, right? You're in that stage of wondering, okay? Gender questioning clients, they are often extremely shy, right? This is a heavy, embarrassing thing for them to talk about. Okay, so creating safety for them, extremely important. The slang term we use in the community for a questioning person is egg, right? The idea being that you're going to hatch out of your egg and become your true self, right? So I have this is sort of a sticker that somebody made in our community, right? There's this lovely girl breaking out of her trans flag colored egg, having a wonderful time. I don't know, these are the people they want to kill. Sometimes it's really confusing for us, right? So you will hear egg used like sort of in a historical way, right? So I might say to you, what really cracked my egg was I wore that really gender bent Halloween costume and it was like the happiest day of my life, right? I might say, what cracked my egg was I was in a really unhealthy relationship and they really wanted me to be this like hyper masculine guy. And I realized I didn't like being put in that box, right? If you know the term egg, you will have clout. Okay, so I'm giving you that one for free. Okay, here it is, my magnum opus. This will help. Everything I just explained, this will make this so much easier. So the binary model, the thing that we have been living under for like the past 500 years, the thing that Europeans sort of inflicted on indigenous culture, the thing that they brought, right, as they colonized the world, it's this model, right? It's a very simple model. It's a binary, right? So there are only two things that actually exist. You've got your women who live over here in the pink city, and you've got your men who live over here in the blue city. And as you'll notice, there's no bridge connecting them, right? There's no way to go from one to the other, right? And there's certainly nothing in between, right? So anything else that exists outside of these two categories is pathologized. Pathologization has sort of two effects, right? So one is, right, this is something that's wrong with you, right? This is a mental illness. This is an abomination, right? So if you imagine smoke coming off of the fire of pathologization, right? When you have somebody who's hostile, right, and coming from the binary model, they're going to say, this is wrong, this is a deviant, this is perverse, this is against God, it's unnatural, freakish, it's mentally ill, right? And these are the types of words your clients are going to be internalizing. This is the air that we are breathing all the time, okay? I don't think there's a single trans person who doesn't have some form of like mental health symptom connected to the transphobia that is out there in the world. Meanwhile, if you have somebody who's supportive, but you know what, they've grown up in a binary model, right? In a binary world, they're going to think like, well, I want to support my kid, but is this safe? This is really different from what I know when I was growing up. This is kind of unknown. It's weird. It's also kind of annoying how my kid keeps asking me to use a different name, right? What's that about, right? What are these pronouns they're talking about? It's kind of off-putting, right? So what we need to do is we need to switch to a better model that actually like acknowledges the natural variability, right, within humanity. This is the bimodal model, right? So if you have a bimodal model, you have still two major statistical peaks, right? So the majority of people are still falling into, right, women and men, right? But then there's a bridge, right? There's a bridge connecting the two. You can actually travel, right? And then living in the middle of the bridge, you've got your non-binary people, your two-spirited people, right? And then on the outskirts of the women's city, right? They like living close to the women's city, but it's not, they don't want to live downtown, right? It doesn't really like suit them fully, right? You've got your trans femme people. The same thing, but the opposite for trans masc people, right? Then if you're born in the woman's city and you're like, this is awful, I hate it here, right? This is just so uncomfortable. You're taking a one-way ticket and you're traveling the men's city, right? Sorry, same thing in the opposite direction for trans women, right? And then if you're to imagine people who like to travel in between the two, those are your nomads, right? Those are your gender fluid people. If you were to zoom out from this model and imagine agender people, they would probably be on the moon, right? They'd be looking down and they'd be like, I don't want to have anything to do with any of that, right? So bimodal models, these tend to do much better in terms of accurately describing human biology, right? Like if we used a binary model for something like eye color, right? You could have blue eyes or you could have brown eyes. Anything else would be pathologized, right? Green eyes, hazel eyes, one blue eye, one brown eye, right? All of those things, something went wrong, right? We got to get you contact lenses, right? Something like that. So a bimodal model of eye color, right, would be, hey, so most people have blue eyes or brown eyes, but then there are hazel eyes and green eyes. Maybe even some people have like red eyes, right, or yellow eyes. And you know what? Some people even have one brown eye and one blue eye, and that's okay, right? That's just human nature, right? We are a species. The way that we reproduce creates diversity and variability. That's how we've survived, right? It's not something to be afraid of. Okay, gender dysphoria. This lovely piece of art was provided to me by a dear friend named Luke. Luke is a trans man who went to the same high school as me. And I asked Luke if he would be willing to provide a piece of art that really encompassed for him the feeling of gender dysphoria. And he gave me this self-portrait of black centipedes crawling out of his mouth. One of the things I do in the trans community is I volunteer at a place called the Ottawa Trans Library. It is a wonderful place. I highly recommend you send your trans clients there if they haven't been. But I run a poetry night there. And early in my process of self-discovery, I was writing a lot of poems. So I'm going to read you a poem describing a little bit of what dysphoria felt like for me, so you get the picture. Okay? Carve a river down my chest. I need something to flow through me again. They're stretching me here, stretching me thin. I am spread screaming across the tanning rack, a meadow of ghostly flesh. I will never become myself again. Living drapery, I am the sheet hanging over my own corpse. Okay? This is what kills us. Right? There is so much discrimination and there is so much hostility, and like we do experience hate crimes. But if you had a perfectly accepting world, gender dysphoria by itself would be killing us. Okay, so this is the thing that so often as therapists and healthcare workers, this is the thing we're trying to help with. Okay, so gender dysphoria is common. When we survey trans people, almost everybody reports having some degree of it, regardless of where they are in the gender spectrum. Dysphoria for someone like me, right, is going to be primarily based around my remaining masculine gender signifiers, right? My voice, Adam's apple, the broadness of my shoulders, my hairline, right? These things, right? My brain is going to hyper focus on, and I'm going to get symptoms of sort of body dysmorphia around them. But very importantly, we're going to talk about this later, dysphoria and dysmorphia, right, are not interchangeable, right? One produces the other. Very important. A non-binary person's dysphoria is going to be very different from mine, right? So they're going to really not like being put in a box, right? They don't like being constrained within the binary, right? So they can experience really different types of discrimination than what I might experience, right? So let's imagine that a non-binary person has a trans woman friend like me, right? And maybe that friend is having a hard day. So they say something like, you know, it's so much easier for you because you just want to be androgynous, right? I look androgynous and I don't want to. I want to look like a woman, right? So you have it easier than me, right? So you want to be very open-minded, right? And you want to find out about your client's specific experience, right? It's not the same for any of us, right? They're going to experience different types of interaction within the community, right? But also different types of reaction from like families and friends, right? If a non-binary person is transitioning, right, the family might say, well, what do you want to be? Right? What are you going towards? And the non-binary person might say, I don't know, I just don't like being in a box, right? And they might say, you don't even know what you are, right? So very different than like somebody saying, you know, well, you were born a boy, so you can't be a girl. You have to accept that, right? That might be something that I might have to deal with more of. So gender dysphoria is political. It is political in the sense that it was used to gatekeep us from healthcare. It is also political within the community itself. So one of the internalized traumas that we have left over from the 20th century is that there are some trans people in the community who believe that you're only a valid trans person if you have the worst dysphoria imaginable. And then you must get every single possible surgical intervention you can. You must change your voice. You must do makeup every single day. We call these people trans medicalists. Okay? So if a trans medicalist was coming after me, they might say, Hazel, well, you're presenting in front of all these people, right? But you didn't do any heavy makeup, right? And you're not even changing your voice that much, right? So you're clearly not a real woman, right? I hope I don't have to explain this, but if you have a client who is a trans medicalist, that is something you're going to want to challenge them on. Okay, you're going to want to build rapport and build up the relationship. But typically speaking, this is a viewpoint that comes from a certain level of anxiety, right? It's like I'm trying to keep myself safe by developing a sense of superiority. Sometimes trans medicalists, they have a sort of pick me type understanding, right? So I'm not one of those annoying trans people who has blue hair and face piercings and who causes all kinds of trouble, right? I'm one of the good ones, right? I did everything right, right? And it's those people, those are the ones that are going to get us all killed, right? So when they come for us, they're going to spare me, right? That's typically not speaking, you know, that's not really how genocide works, right? So if you encounter this, take your time with it. If you challenge them right out of the gate, they're probably going to leave therapy, right? But over time, once you've built the relationship, right, you want to start pointing out how this might hurt them, okay? The official viewpoint in the community, gender dysphoria is not required. Okay, we have people who reach out to us from countries where to get gender affirming care would mean that you were breaking the law, right? That you could be executed. Right? So these people will reach out and they will say, I don't think I can ever medically transition, but am I still trans? Am I still a part of the community? And the answer is, of course, yes. Okay? You don't need dysphoria. Very, very important. Okay, there are multiple different types of dysphoria. This is something that is really important to understand. So the most common type that many of you are familiar with, probably just from movies and the news, is physical dysphoria. Comes with a sense of body mismatch, right? Where are my boobs, right? Where is, that body part that I'm supposed to have, right? I can feel that it's missing. For trans women, having the wrong genitalia between their legs can feel like having cancer, right? For a trans man, it can feel like somebody amputated them. They can feel sort of like a eunuch. We will often experience phantom pain, especially once we get into transition and we have the right hormone. I will sometimes get pain where I feel like my womb should be. Okay, so there's a very like physical embodied sense of distress. However, it's not just distress, it's also an absence of joy, especially pre-transition. So before I realized what was going on with me, I was just really not interested in presenting as a guy. So what would happen? I live with my brother, and he would be, ordering some clothes online for himself, and I'd be like, "Hey, can you get me like one extra, right? Because I think I should probably have a shirt, that doesn't have holes in it, right? Like there's just no joy from one's body. Okay, you don't feel any kind of connection to it. Then you have presentational dysphoria, right? So when I was growing up, I went to a Christian private school, and at that school, there was a rule that if you were a boy, you could not have long hair, right? So sometimes when I was being driven home by my parents, we would take a wrong turn, and I'd be like, "Hey, where are we going?" Right? And they'd be like, "We're going to get your hair cut." I'd be like, "No." Right? So there's a sense of like your presentational signifiers, right? Maybe you're a girl or you think you're a girl, right? But meanwhile, like the other girls are really into clothing, makeup, hairstyle, right? And you're like, this is not for me. This is producing friction, right? There's distress, discomfort. Okay, then sort of what we talked about a bit earlier, there is biochemical dysphoria, right? So feeling foggy, distant, having no joy or purpose, feeling disconnected from your body and your emotions, and feeling numb, right? There is almost a constant sense of being separated from the self, right? Very hard to identify if it's all you've ever known. Then you have social dysphoria, and this one's really often overlooked. So the way that we are treated by other people, right? When I was in the boys' locker room or the boys' change room as a kid, I felt like an anthropologist, right? I was studying the room, trying to figure out how do I communicate with these people. To give you an example, when I was in grade 5, so I was 11 years old, I walked up to a friend of mine. His name was Joel. And I told Joel, Joel, you're kind of like one of the popular kids. And you'll notice that the other boys, they'll kind of come up to you and like they'll always laugh at your jokes, even if they're like not that funny. And also they'll make jokes to you to try to get you to laugh to sort of like curry favor. And poor Joel was like, "I'm 11, please stop." Right? So I wasn't like that around girls, right? I've actually felt pretty comfortable and I didn't think about it too much, right? And then all of a sudden I hit puberty and my mood just plummets, okay? A major part of transition for many people is just this, just being regarded for how they feel on the inside, right? For a trans woman, having other women be comfortable around you, right? To not perceive you as a threat or as a predator, right? Is an enormous part of transition, right? For trans men, being regarded as like one of the guys, right? That's so, so important. This is also important when we think about like the cumulative trauma that trans people go through, right? When they transition later in life, right? So if you are having sex, right, and you're not having sex in a way that actually sort of aligns with how you feel, right, that is pretty upsetting, right? So when we think about how this manifests in terms of our mental health symptoms, so many trans people have symptoms of complex PTSD. We'll talk a bit more about that later. So dysphoria can be hard to recognize, right? The cliche is that you're a woman trapped in a man's body, but it's not that simple. It's a feeling of detachment from your body and from yourself. So why is it hard to recognize? Well, there's not a lot of exposure to the concept of gender mismatch, right? When I was a kid and I was growing up, I didn't know that being trans was even an option. I didn't know that this mismatch would create distress, right? I had no way of naming what was going on inside of me. Okay. Then at the same time, because of the media narratives, right, later on about like what a trans person is, right, we get all of these false impressions, right? So there I was, and I was, sort of a young adult, and I was starting to pick up on the fact that maybe I wasn't too happy with the way that things were, right? But right, I was like, oh, those trans people, they're so incredible, they're so amazing, they're so brave, right? And they must go through so much pain. Well, I'm in a bit of pain, right? But it can't be that bad, right? There's that like distancing effect. The most common media narrative that is pushed by like news agencies is sort of, oh, when I was 6 years old, I tried on my mother's heels and I did my makeup and I knew ever since then. That is actually extremely uncommon for us. Okay, the vast majority of us, there is so much doubt and so much questioning. There is like getting in and out of the like the realization, right? Going back into denial. I think one of the other really common myths is that dysphoria, like it has to be something that's absolutely debilitating. You have to like self-mutilate, right? You have to be like trying to cut off your own genitals. That is simply not true. Dysphoria for so many of us is simply this horrible emptiness, this constant depression and anxiety. So as a therapist or as any kind of healthcare worker, what's so important is that if you have a gender questioning client, you educate them on the different types of dysphoria and on the diversity of the experience. Okay. So another part of what makes it so hard to know that you're trans is symptoms of dissociation and depersonalization, right? So depersonalization is a sense of detachment or estrangement from the self, right? I know I have feelings, but I don't feel them, right? So you'll kind of just be going through your day, right? And it'll just feel gray and empty and numb, right? There's this sense of estrangement and alienation, right? You will feel like you are just going through the motions. There is a pointlessness to life, right? You want to think about what would my life feel like if I couldn't feel my emotions, right? How meaningful would it be to me to get a job, to get a degree, to be in a happy, healthy relationship, right? And how painful would it be to see other people going through those milestones and taking so much joy from them, right? You get so much pain, right? Feeling that distance from between yourself and other people. To give you a sense of this, when I was fully closeted, I had no idea what was going on. I would tell my friends that I was a fishbowl on top of a meat robot, and my body would simply take me from room to room. Okay, I had no idea that that feeling was actually connected to dysphoria. Symptoms of depersonalization are generally characterized as feelings of unreality. It's particularly difficult for patients to describe, right, because it can get habituated, right? It becomes normal. So it's like you've been watching a TV on mute your entire life, right? And then one day you start taking estrogen, and then somebody walks into the room and they're like, you have volume now, right? And it's like, oh my God, I didn't realize, right? I didn't realize that there was like texture to life, that there was color to life, that there was experience, right? Again, this is not everybody's experience, but for many of us, right? This is why our healthcare is so precious to us. We would never go back, right? Because it's the difference between living a full life and living a sort of half life, right? For me, the last 4 years, those have been the most textured, detailed, emotion-filled years of my life. I have more memories from the last 4 years than I do from the previous 27. Okay? When we get gender-affirming care, right, when we get hormone therapy and surgery, our symptoms of dissociation and depersonalization decrease. Okay? This is so, so important. So when we're getting gender affirming care, right, our symptoms get better. If you were to look at studies where they've tried physical intervention for body dysmorphia, right, stuff like surgeries, you would find a success rate of about 0 to 2%. Okay, so you cannot, as a therapist, say to a trans client, it's all just in your head, right? Oh, like you don't have dysphoria, it's just that you're just down on yourself, right? That is not the way you want to go about this, right? Helping a client with dysphoria, it's a matter of supporting them towards the physical interventions. And then at the same time, it's like you're doing a dialectic, right? So on the one hand, you want cognitive flexibility, right? So being a cis woman, right? If a cis woman was listening to metal music, would that make her not a woman, right? You want to do those exercises so the client learns to be more kind to themselves. But then at the same time, right, they're gonna feel better if they can get HRT, if they can get surgery, right? So encouraging them, referring them, guiding them to resources, supporting them in that journey. It's very, very, very important. Okay, so a common question that I am asked as a trans therapist is, why is it that some people know at an early age while others discover their identity later in life, right? Why is it that we have trans kids who sometimes figure things out as early as age 4? And why is it that there are people like me who figure out at age 27, right? Surely we couldn't be the same thing, right? So we have an explanation for this. So imagine that you've got a trans kid, right? And they are trying to figure out what's going on, right? What are these weird feelings I'm having inside of myself? So over here, you have the knowledge that they would need to figure things out, right? The knowledge they need to be able to name the feeling, okay? Now, one of the really interesting things about being trans is that you are starting off within the majority, right? The world assumes that you're cis. And one of the things the majority does is it insulates itself from knowledge of the minority, okay? So for example, let's say you've got a white person walking down the street at night, right? They don't really need to understand the interior experience of a Black person walking behind them, right? Meanwhile, that Black person really needs to understand, right? If I walk too closely to this white person, are they going to be afraid of me? Are they going to think I'm trying to steal from them, right? Is there going to be some kind of bias in their head? Because if they aren't aware of that, right, they could get the police called on them and they could be killed, right? So the minority has to constantly read what's going on in the majority. The majority has no such obligation. Okay, so this is a factor with trans people, right? We have no real reason to seek out the knowledge, right? When you're going to school, right? They're not really teaching you these things. But then on top of that, the majority often actively punishes curiosity towards the minority. Okay, so let's say you're in middle school and there is an openly gay kid at school, right? And you start to become friends with them, right? All of a sudden, the other kids are saying, oh, you must be gay, right? And so the next day, you don't sit with them at lunch, right? You go back and you sit with your old friend group, right? Imagine what would happen if you went to the library and you got a book about gender or being trans, right? How are your friends going to react, right? If your parents aren't supportive, how are they going to react, right? If you are at a religious school, right? What are the teachers going to say? What are they going to think, right? So there's this sort of hovering sense of punishment for exploration, right? People don't even have to say it directly, right? Your parents could be openly supportive, but maybe they were watching a newscast about gay marriage. And when two men kissing were shown on screen, you see your father grimace, right? There's just a sense of like, oh, I'm building my model of the world. I'm starting to understand this isn't okay. Okay, so that walls you off from the knowledge you need to be able to describe yourself. Okay, meanwhile, you also have gender mystification, right? So this drives me absolutely crazy. So we have a way of speaking about the genders as if they are like different species, right? So men are from Mars and women are from Venus. And like you'll see like a tabloid cover and it'll say, men, what do they want? Right? We did a study, we finally figured out what they want, right? As if we had to send a diplomat, right? There is actually not that much difference between human brains, right? There's not really like a male brain and a female brain, right? That kind of comes from patriarchal sexism, right? That men are smarter and stronger and they should be leaders, right? And with women, they have weak and stupid brains and they should be in the kitchen, right? It's this like idea that we have these like complete opposite roles. Okay, so this will get so bad at times where you will have people grow up and they will believe like I don't think women have a sex drive, right? I think women give sex to men when the man has sort of been good, right? They give it as rewards, right? There's like that much distancing from one another. Okay. So this creates the sense inside of a trans person, right, that the thoughts that I am having could not possibly be thoughts that the other gender has, right? Like there I am, right, as a young person, and I'm thinking, oh, sure seems like life would be better if I was a girl. Well, I'm a boy, so that's a boy thought, right? Like there's this, again, this sort of walling off from like self-knowledge. Okay, in addition to that, there is enormous stigma against gender nonconformity, right? So boys who exhibit feminine behaviors are referred to psychology, right, to psychiatric appointments at 3 times the rate of girls who are referred for like masculine behavior, right? This is something we punish and we pathologize, right? It is extremely common to be bullied for being gender nonconforming as a human being, especially as a kid, right? It's very common to have post-traumatic stress for being gender nonconforming, even as a cis person growing up, right? So you learn this is not okay, and these feelings, I should dissociate through them and I should compartmentalize them, right? Or else they'll get me in trouble. Then you have gender constancy. So gender identity emerges in a human being, usually between the ages of 2 and 3. But the idea that gender is permanent, this is something that typically only arrives later. So the idea is that if you have like a 4-year-old who's able to name what's going on inside of them, right? That's how you get a trans kid. I actually have a step niece who is trans, and she has been transitioning longer than me. She's about 11 years old. She started at age 4, right? And these parents, they were not like friends with the LGBT community. They had no idea what was going on. And at first they were like, okay, well, maybe it'll pass, right? And then month after month after month, this like 4-year-old and 5-year-old, she just kept saying to them, stop calling me that name. That's a boy's name, right? I don't want to wear those clothes, right? And so eventually they realized, okay, we have to like talk to a therapist. And they lost an enormous amount of their family and their support network because they made the decision to support this person. Okay, there are trans kids who figure it out early, who do not get support from their parents, and working with them is harrowing. Okay, imagine going through the wrong puberty and knowing it's wrong. Okay, I've had clients describe to me the sense of their skull growing in the wrong way. Okay, people in the trans community, we tend to be big fans of body horror movies, stuff like The Thing, right? Because it's familiar. Okay, so again, when we're thinking about complex PTSD, right? Whether you know it or you don't, right? It's this constant daily trauma. So, right, if you're walled off from the information, right, and you're taught to not think about these feelings, right, and then gender constancy sinks in as an idea, right, you get sort of insulated and you get locked in. Okay, so that's how we have trans kids and trans adults.
I'm just going to jump in quickly to let you know that we are quickly at 107. I do believe that we have more than 80 people that are still on the call, so we can go, I think till whenever is okay with you. I don't mind staying on till 11:15 and then taking another 15 for questions. But
Okay.
just wanted to give you that heads up that some people might start leaving. And yes, the recording will be available on YouTube later on. We will send an email after the session to let you guys know how you can connect with Hazel and to get a link to the recording. So just a heads up for you, Hazel.
Okay. Thank you so much, Charlene. I'll try to move things along here. So another very common question we'll get from gender questioning clients, also from parents and just people who think this might just be a sex thing, right? So is this just a fetish? So this is not the question we actually want to be asking. We actually want to be thinking about sublimation. So sublimation is an old psychological concept back from the days of Freud, where basically the idea is that we are animals, but we're living in civilization. So we will have socially inappropriate desires, right? You're walking down the street, you want somebody's hamburger, right? But to take their hamburger, that would be stealing. You'd probably start a fight, right? So you have a socially inappropriate desire, and the brain has to convert that to something more acceptable, right? So to use an example, you want to punch your boss in the face, right? They are really pissing you off, right? But there's this annoying societal prescription against violence, right? So your brain sublimates the desire into something more acceptable. So on your way out of the building, you kick a trash can, right? So if we apply that same understanding to a trans person, right? Let's use a trans woman as an example. So the desire to be female, right? When you are assigned male at birth, that is socially very inappropriate, right? There is a massive stigma against gender nonconforming people, and there's transphobia. Okay, so your brain sublimates that, right? And when you're in the bedroom, right, when you're by yourself on your laptop, right, maybe you kind of get it out of your system in a sexual way, right? You get that energy out of yourself. This is a very common experience for trans people early on, and it's very confusing, right? It's oftentimes an enormous source of self-doubt. So if they ask you, is it just a fetish? You want to get them to instead think about, what could this fetish be sublimating? Okay. Sometimes people do cross-dress and it doesn't have anything to do with their gender identity, right? That's probably a sign that it's sublimating something else, right? Maybe they feel like they want to give up control, right? Maybe they feel like they want to be more vulnerable, right? But they can't do that out in the world or at work, right? So it's a worthy thing to investigate for questioning clients. So when you have a questioning client, what do you do? What are you allowed to do? So the first thing, you are a lighthouse, you are not a tugboat, right? You do not tell somebody that you think they are trans. This is a rule we actually have in the community itself. We call it the Egg Prime Directive. For those of you who are not familiar with Star Trek, that's where we take it from. In Star Trek, the worst thing you can do is you can interact with a species who has not yet made it to space, right? You interfere with their natural development, right? So the idea is that you don't interfere with a trans person who hasn't figured it out yet, right? There's a reason we have this as a rule. So because we live in a society where like gender nonconformity is so seriously punished, right? If you tell someone they're trans, they're likely to push back and to get defensive. I had an ex, kind of an abusive ex, who after we broke up, they said to me, do you think you might be trans? Right? And that pushed me further away from figuring it out because I didn't want them to have like anything on me, right? I didn't want them to be able to say this about me, right? That I wasn't like a real guy, right? So there's the defense mechanism. Now, they need to be confident when they come out, right? This is really important. You live in a hostile world when you are trans, right? So if you didn't make the realization yourself, the moment you get dysphoric, right? And dysphoria, it has a way of saying to you, you're not really a woman. This is all just in your head. You made this up, right? It's sort of like depression, the way depression convinces a client, like, I'm not really depressed. I just don't work hard enough, right? Dysphoria functions the same way. So the moment they get hit by that, they'll think, oh, it was that therapist. It was that therapist who told me I was trans, right? They brainwashed me, right? And then they'll likely like lose confidence in themselves, right? So you need to let them figure it out. You need to let them figure it out themselves. You can't hatch an egg from the outside. So what can you actually do? Well, you're going to guide them, right? You're not going to push, you're just going to guide, right? So you're going to encourage them, you're going to validate them and reassure them, right? It's a very embarrassing thing to admit that you're struggling with this. It's hard to talk about, right? So you're letting them know that it's okay to explore this, that it's okay to explore these feelings. You're going to encourage them to try things, right? Try out a new name, try out pronouns, right? If you have supporting friends or a supportive partner, right? Try these things with them. Try them with me in session if that would help you, okay? Providing a safe space. When I started therapy, all that my therapist had in her office was a pamphlet on the wall that said straight but not narrow, right? So I knew she was an ally. I knew it was safe to talk to her, okay? You want to refer them to specialists and to resources, right? So if you're a cisgender therapist, right, you're not going to know the lay of the land as much. But if you know people in the community like me, right, if you know places like the Centertown Community Health Center, if you know places like the Ottawa Trans Library, if you know places like Kind Space, these will all be listed later, but these are things you can guide your client towards. You're going to work through the myths and misconceptions we talked about earlier, right? I must have the worst dysphoria in the world in order to be trans, right? I should have known when I was a little kid, right? These are myths, right? Let them know that. You want to help them navigate, right? Help them find their own answers, encourage the journey, normalize the journey. One of the best resources out there for this is called the Gender Dysphoria Bible. Okay, you can see the lovely artwork they have here. This is a fantastic place for both therapist education and for self-education. Okay, it will teach you everything that I laid out today and then some. So very, very, very good to send both yourself and your clients there. Okay, co-occurring conditions. So the first thing you need to know when you're working with trans people is that they are extremely neurodivergent, okay? You can see here, this is from Australia. This is a comparison of the trans population versus the, the sort of cisgender population. Our rates of neurodivergence are absolutely through the roof. It's going to equate to about 1 in 4. I can tell you in my experience, it's kind of higher than that. When I'm working with a trans person, I rule out neurodivergence, okay? But I typically assume that it's there. This is sometimes very difficult because trans people will not know that they're neurodivergent, right? So they'll be struggling with all kinds of trauma unique to that, right? Why is it that other people can get their papers in, right? I'm one of the most passionate people in the class, but when I hand in a paper, it's, I did it 30 minutes before the professor tells me I wasn't applying myself. Okay, so there's specific elements in there to think about in treatment. Some people use the fact that someone is neurodivergent to say that there's no way they could know that they're trans. This is especially common for autistic individuals. Okay, what we actually understand is that if you are already experiencing a lot of friction in the world, you're likely to realize that you're different in other ways as well, right? So an autistic person has a sort of mental phone book of social rules they have to memorize, right? Like, how much eye contact am I supposed to make? How far away am I supposed to stand from people, right? Like, what's an appropriate thing to talk about, right? Did they mean that literally, right? So you can imagine, right, that maybe they don't learn the rule that you're supposed to be gender conforming, right? So they're like, oh, I'd like to do this, right? And then all of a sudden people are upset, right? And they're like, huh? Well, that's a rule too, right? For ADHD people, the number one thing that closes the motivational gap is passion. And you know what we're really not passionate about? Dressing up as the gender we don't identify as, right? So there'll be this like heavy, annoying friction trying to get these like sort of gendered tasks done. We will find them almost impossible to put our mind to, hard to focus on. Being a competent counselor for trans clients means being a competent neurodiverse counselor, full stop. Okay, the intersectional implications here are enormous. Okay, it is very hard to get a name change form done when you have Godzilla-sized ADHD, right? It is very hard to learn how to braid your hair, how to do your makeup, right? This affects everything, right? How sensitive you are. Autistic and ADHD people have a 30 to 40% higher chance of developing PTSD, right? Because the nervous system in its dysregulation is more sensitive to being overwhelmed by the environment. So you combine that with, right, experiencing dysphoria as you grow up. Sexuality. So it used to be that if you wanted to transition in the 20th century, you had to be straight. So if you were transitioning to a woman, you had to date men. If you were transitioning to a man, you had to date women, right? You have to be heterosexual by the end of things. If you look at the data, heterosexual is one of the least common sexual orientations amongst trans people. Okay, the vast majority of us are bisexual, right? Many of us are asexual, right? Many of us are gay, right? So this is another point of intersectionality. What is it like for a trans lesbian to be dating a cisgender woman, right? What is the effect on their mental health, right? Maybe that partner is extremely affirming. Maybe that partner causes a lot of insecurity, right? Maybe somebody tries to be heterosexual purely to get the validation that comes from men finding them attractive. Okay, so these are important things to think about in the therapeutic relationship. Comorbidities. So the main things that your trans clients are going to be struggling with are depression, anxiety, PTSD, eating disorders, suicide, self-harm, and substance use. There's also an enormous amount of chronic pain in the trans community. We experience absolutely massive discrimination. So you can see a list here, right? Housing, employment, harassment at the workplace, sexual assault, poverty, incarceration, self-reported poor mental health. Of the LGBT community, we have by far the worst rates for all of these things. There was a massive survey in the United States in 2011. 90% of transgender Americans surveyed reported anti-trans bias at work. I've had it at my workplace, right? It's just sort of a fact of life. I work at wonderful places, right? But still, people, sometimes they don't get it, right? 43% reported having attempted suicide, okay? This last statistic here, this is probably the most terrifying. So if you are a cisgender person and you get a university degree, that's going to correlate to improvements in quality of life, right? Things like income, right, are just going to directly improve, things like your physical health, right? If you're trans and you get a university degree, being trans nullifies the benefit of getting post-secondary education, right? It wipes out that positive effect on your quality of life. Minority stress, right? So I'm sure many of you are familiar with this concept, right? If you are a minority in the world and the world is hostile towards you, that takes a toll on your mind and your body. There was a famous study comparing African-American women to their white counterparts, and they controlled, right, for financial background, socioeconomics, and they found that the African-American woman sometimes had a biological age almost 8 years older, right, because of the accumulated stress, right? Having to worry, is my kid coming home today, right? Or are they going to be arrested or shot, right? Having to worry when I go out, right? Just to get something from the grocery store. What if a cop pulls me over, I scare him and he kills me, and now my kid is an orphan, right? Just having to have that background radiation in your head every day. It's the same thing for trans people, right? And it manifests in oftentimes massive stress hormone disorders, right? So we have an enormous amount of stomach problems. We have fibromyalgia, right? IBS, these kinds of things. If you look at the trans march during Pride, you will see a lot of us walking with canes, right? Because we've been going through this for such a long time. The blue column, that's your trans people. Orange is your cisgender people, right? So self-rated fair or poor mental health, diagnosed with a mood or anxiety disorder, seriously contemplated suicide, used drugs or alcohol to cope with violence, right? Our rates are just so much higher, right? Now, I know all of that is very dark, right? But the good news is that you, even just as a single supporting person in a trans person's life, you can have an enormous effect. So for a trans or non-binary youth, having just one supporting adult significantly lowered the odds of attempting suicide in the past year by almost 40%, right? You can be that adult for a trans kid in therapy, right? In Ontario, we did a study, right? 35% seriously considered suicide, 11% attempted, okay? But if they reported lower transphobia, right? 66% reduction in suicidal ideation, 76% reduction in suicide attempts. If you can get your trans clients to a supportive and affirming environment, like if this was a pharmaceutical, it would be a miracle drug, right? So there is so much power to be found in acceptance. Okay, coming up right to the end here, I like to end with this because I think this is a common sort of concern that many people have, right? So why can't trans kids just like wait till they're 18, right? Surely they shouldn't be making these like major decisions about themselves and their bodies at such a young age. So we're going to cover this very quickly because it'll take care of myths that you can tackle for your trans clients. It'll also help your own brain be a bit more confident in working with trans people. Okay, so better outcomes earlier. Okay, so the biggest survey we ever did was the 2015 US Transgender Survey. Okay, we had 27,000 people in that sample. If you started hormones in early adolescence, you had a 222% reduction in severe distress and an 135 lower percent risk of suicidal ideation. Okay, if you start in later adolescence, right, instead of 14 or 16, you're more like 18, 19. The reductions are still very high, but you're losing almost 70% of the reduction you were getting for severe distress, right? And it's very similar, right, for suicidal ideation as well. You then push that to adulthood, and again, almost like a 70% jump and a 40% jump. So you want to ask yourself, right, if I'm a parent, right, and my kid is distressed and they're suicidal, do I want them to have a 222% reduction in that distress or an 81% reduction, right? Do I want them to have a 135% reduction in suicidal ideation, or do I want them to have a 21% reduction, right? Again, if this was a pharmaceutical, right, it would be a miracle drug. The earlier you can start, even if you're just doing social transition at a young age, right, the better the outcome you will have. Right? So kids who were allowed to socially transition to live as their identified gender, their well-being was similar to or better than cis peers in the general population. Okay, so think about all the horrible stuff I just told you, right, about our comorbidities, right, about discrimination. Your well-being is the same or better if you're just allowed to be yourself as a kid. Okay? Early transition virtually eliminates higher rates of depression and low self-worth. Okay? Comparable to cisgender children in measures of mental health. Okay, detransition. So there's been a common talking point, right? With this massive pandemic of transgender people spreading across the world, certainly there are going to be tons of people who realize that this wasn't for them and that they've made a horrible mistake. So we're going to just debunk this very quickly. So when we give the most leeway to a study, right? Like if we go for studies, for example, there was the CAS report in the UK, which was sort of designed to attack us. One of the things the CAS report did was it said, we aren't going to look at any studies that don't have a control group. Well, the problem with having a control group for gender affirming care, right, is you're taking hormones. Right? So if you're in the control group, you're going to notice really quickly, right, that you're being given a sugar pill. So it's typically something that a lot of people would say, this isn't really ethical. We shouldn't be doing this to patients, right? So even when we used the CAS report's statistics, detransition rates cannot get above 4.5%, right? So like 95 to 96% of trans people in that sample still, right, they made the right decision for themselves. If you look at other studies, the rate can sometimes be as low as 0.5%. Okay, but then this is the kicker. Of those that detransition, 90% of them are due to social factors and external pressure, right? Discrimination, housing, not having a job, right? 0.4% of those who detransition, so 0.4% of this 4.5% say that the reason they're doing it was because transitioning was wrong for them. Okay? So to really hit this home, I'll give you one more study here. Of the 3,398 patients who had appointments during this period, 16 expressed transition-related regret or detransitioned. Of the 16, 10 stated they were only temporarily detransitioning due to social factors. Okay, so it begs the question, do trans lives matter? Right? If we are taking away healthcare from 3,300 and about 80 people, right? Because 10 people, right? Or 6 people rather, figured out that it wasn't for them. Whose lives are being valued more? Okay. Gender affirming surgeries are some of the least regretted surgeries that humanity performs. They have a lower regret rate than life-saving surgeries like heart transplants and hip replacements. So, very last thing we're going to cover here. If you have a trans client in therapy, they might not even want to talk about trans issues, right? They might just want to get help with anxiety or depression. But if, like, there is dysphoria they need to work through, you're going to need to look at complex PTSD. Okay. For that, I highly, highly, highly recommend stuff like narrative exposure therapy, where you are sort of gluing together the various traumatic events of their past and building a narrative through that, right? You want to help them develop emotional regulation skills. You want to help them process their trauma, right? Almost all of us will have internalized transphobia. For that, the cognitive flexibility exercises I mentioned earlier, those are very, very effective. For neurodivergence, right? You want to stop them from forgetting that they have a neurodevelopmental disability, right? So I'm late to work. It must be because I'm a bad person. I don't try hard enough. No, like you have a brain where like time blindness is a factor, right? So you have to be gentle with yourself, right? Then teaching them skills to help with that, right? How do I counter the time blindness? Well, like setting alarms, creating structure in the morning, right? And then very, very important, grief and acceptance, right? There are some things that we can't change when we transition in adulthood, right? There are some things that we're stuck with, right? We have to accept these things. We have to be able to find the beauty in being trans, right? So for me, it's something like, you know what? Yes, there are days where I really wish I was cis, right? And it's painful. But also, I know that the way that I appreciate femininity, I know that the way that I feel about my gender is probably unique to the fact that I am trans. The reason that I find it so beautiful and why I think it's worth doing this, right, is connected to my transness, right? So validating, right, reframing, but also learning how to focus on what we can control, right? So I can't like change the structure of my face, not without like really intense, expensive surgery, right? But I can learn how to do makeup, right? I can learn how to work on my hair, right? These kinds of things, right? As I mentioned earlier, dialectics, right? The dialectic between doing something to get myself physically changed, that will help, but also, right? If a cis woman has small breasts, that doesn't make her a woman, right? So the dialectic between acceptance and change. Down here, I just have a very basic guide from one of my favorite books about CPTSD. So reciprocal verbal ventilation, right? Getting into emotional authenticity, right? And then reparenting by committee, getting into accepting and supportive environments. These are my favorite books for working with trans people. These are some of the affirming places in the city. Presentation is done here. I can show you my references on the next slides, but yeah, thank you for bearing with me for this long. I know I went very, very over time. Sometimes I underestimate just how much more I've learned since I first gave this presentation. But yes, if any of you who are still here would ever like to consult with me, if you ever want to refer someone to me, if you ever want to reach out, please, my email is right there. I also have a CFS email, hhunt@cfsottawa.ca. I also have a private practice email as well. But if you just get in touch with me, we will get whoever you're trying to help to the right place.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm going to just stop the recording.